Hello, Veritas Academy community. This is now coming into our fifth week here at Veritas Academy. And one of the questions I've had, or one of the parts of our discussions as faculty that we have, and you think we wouldn't have this necessarily, is, so what are we doing here? What is education? You think teachers, and we do know this, we grapple with that question really quite frequently. What are we doing here? Which might seem a bit odd because we're educators, right? And that's what we're trained to do, and that's true. But I think we live in a culture that has it very confused, and our culture doesn't quite understand what education is here for. When I worked at Lancaster Bible College, we actually had this discussion quite often. How do we ensure that our college in this world of education doesn't slip into where so many schools have gone? What keeps a school from going down that road to giving up on its core convictions and values? I'm not worried about that here at Veritas Academy, but it does raise the question, what are we doing here when we do education? And the culture that we're living in has really gotten that quite confused in ways that can be seemingly harmless, but actually quite harmful. If you ask a lot of people what education is about, they'd say something along the lines of, well, it's here to give you skills and abilities. It's here to train your understanding and to give you knowledge. And those are all wonderful things. We need those things. It's part of what education does, right? Your students are taking tests and they're learning information and they're gaining valuable skills. But there's a subtle problem actually with that definition. And it's subtle maybe in your hearing, but it's actually quite profound in its implications. There is, in education, like in all things, there is a tool that you use, and there is an end, or a telos, right? The word telos is a fancy Greek word that really means the goal of the operation. What are you hoping to achieve with this? And these two things are part of the education, like they're part of anything. You have a tool that you're using and a goal that you're arriving at. When we talk about skills and abilities and grades, all these really good things in education, partly what's happened is we've subtly confused the end and the goal with the tool. What do I mean by that? Consider for a minute if you were to take someone and just say, we're going to give you $1 million to do whatever you want with it. Money's power, right? And you can do things with it. It could build things and buy things, right? Would that be a good thing or a bad thing? Well, the question I haven't asked is, well, who are you giving it to? It's not just an end. Like if you just have money, things get better. We all know that money is a tool, and a tool itself actually needs to be put to use for a purpose or a goal. There has to be an end in mind. If you give money to the wrong person, then actually you get really bad results, quite frankly. But if you give money to a good person, a person who knows how to do it, then you get amazingly good results. The tool is actually quite neutral. In education, what has happened is the idea of grades and the idea of skills and abilities and knowledge are themselves not the end of education. Just giving those things to someone actually doesn't necessarily help them. And it doesn't sound right because it feels like that's what education is supposed to do. But in reality, if you give those things to people without giving them the thing that's the most important, then you actually not help them grow. What you've given them is tools, skills, and abilities to do things that might not, in fact, benefit them, their lives or their communities. C.S. Lewis said it this way: education is teaching people to like and dislike what they ought. And what is C.S. Lewis getting at? The tools that we have for education have a goal. The goal is not to be good at things. The goal is to be wise. The goal is to have a mature soul that loves the things that are lovely. Now you'd say, well, how does that make sense of taking a math test? Or how does that make sense of, having to read a lot in omnibus or to master a language? Well, the reason that sounds confusing is because it seems like the goal in those things is just to get good at that stuff. But in reality, if you watch what your students do when they go through the process, the goal really is to train them on self-discipline. Give them the ability to understand broader things in their world so they kind of know where they're located. They understand how to use those skills and abilities for the benefit of those around them, for their families, for their cultures, their communities, and their churches. Those skills they're learning in all of those classes are not the end for why they're here. In fact, those skills and abilities are put to a much larger purpose, and that is to raise up young men and women that have souls that are mature. Let's put it all together. If you have skill and ability, that's one thing and really important. You know what to do with it, right? Your soul is grown up and mature. When we combine those two things, we get wisdom. Wisdom is not just the ability to do cool stuff. It's not the ability to be efficient. Wisdom is the largeness of soul to know how to use the skills that you have. Of course, if you have largeness of soul and you're very mature, but you have no ability, well, that's not very useful, right? Because you can't really do the things you know that need to be done. But if you have skill and ability, but you don't have largeness of soul, then in fact, you're in a worse condition. And I would argue that a lot of what's happened in our cultures, we're watching the descent of our culture, is that actually it's an education that has no soul. I know there's lots of things going on in education we don't like these days in our culture, and that's true. But one of the problems at the heart of it is that we're empowering our young people with lots of abilities and skills, but zero soul. We haven't trained them what to do with it. We haven't given them wisdom. Why are you here? What's the important thing? How do you see this in service to God, who is your ultimate creator and your ultimate purpose and meaning? That's the point of education. And I know sometimes in the middle of all the details and hard work, it can feel like that busyness is just what your student is doing. I know this. I've got 2 girls now here yet and 1 off in college, and busyness seems to be a way of life. And that's true. And my own daughters debate with me sometimes about education. It's like, Dad, I could get this information elsewhere. I'm saying, no, you can, but you can't get a bigness of soul. And that's why you're here working with your teachers. And that's why you're everyday disciplined. You may not be a math person. That's okay. But you're learning how to be self-controlled and disciplined and hard work, and how to learn how to critically think. Because what I'm interested in ultimately is a person that has the soul enough to be wise to know how to handle life's problems, wise to know how to help your community without lashing out thoughtlessly, without using your skills and abilities in ways that are in fact harmful for others. And what makes the difference really in those tools is not the proficiency of using those tools, but it's actually knowing what to do with them. This year in our devotions, I've asked Mr. Timmons to think through what we would do as a book, and we both decided that Proverbs is what we want to do. Why Proverbs? Because Proverbs is going to help introduce students to what my good friend Michael Bedriacki would say, Sophia, and she is necessary. Because once you have wisdom, once you learn what to do with the tools that you have, then you have purpose and meaning. And that's really what we're doing here. We want to see students grow up, certainly to be skilled. We want them to go to college and be successful, absolutely. But that really is only a tool to something much larger. We want them to grow a bigness of soul, and we want them to leave with wisdom. That is a tough task. And that's a task that is not easily landed. It's not a simple thing of just accomplishing good grades and managing skills and getting those things done right, getting your college application, so forth and so on. It's something that's much more complicated. It happens in this space of relationships and teachers and authority and obeying rules and dress code and making sure you have your belts on Wednesday. It also means doing well in your math classes and in your omnibus classes. And I'm hoping as parents that you see that that's the enterprise we're about. That's what my faculty are absolutely passionate about here, is to see your students grow up in wisdom and the nurture of the Lord. And that's a hard task, and it does mean business, and it does mean getting good grades. But please help your students understand, and help us together as we work together to understand that those things are not the end goal of why we're here. Those are just the tools setting us up for the great telos of why we're here, and that is students of big souls, so they learn to dislike and like what they ought, and that they can serve the Lord with their lives. I'm looking forward to this year. I'm already excited about the way it's going. I love your students. This place is alive and excited with learning and growth, and it's going to be a great year. Have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you next week.